Hey everyone, my name is Malte. There's a picture of me on the slide, which is helpful. So I am the tech lead of AMP. I lead the team at Google working on it and hang out on GitHub sometimes. I have a question though at the start. Who here is born in the 80s or earlier and lived in Europe in the 90s? Right. You would have seen like these sold on TV CD samplers, and there's Dream Dance and Tunnel Transforce. I can always have to think of these two when Dreamforce conference is going on in San Francisco. And that's the reason why we're here today, because we originally wanted to make this and had everything planned for San Francisco, but then we realized like the hotels are $800, $900 a night, and it's just not happening. So welcome to Mountain View. It's great here. I don't live here, but I come here every day, and that's fun. Anyway, I'm giving a keynote, which usually means I have to like go through random stuff, which makes it really difficult to kind of create a talk that's coherent and makes sense. But I tried to put all the topics on how you're supposed to write a book, I think. I don't know. So we'll have some like cool starts. I'm talking about the governance changes that we proposed last week. Then I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about AMP's design and going even more deeper on that. And finally, I'm closing with like my thoughts about 2019, kind of as an inspiration for especially the breakout sessions tomorrow. More stuff to talk about. But first of all, thank all of you for coming. You're the people working on AMP. It's great. It's nice to see this happening just like 3 years into the project. And there's many of you. So overall, 710 apparently people have written code contributions for the repositories in the AMP project org in GitHub. This is obviously people only writing code, and I think it's always important to recognize that people make contributions beyond just code, right? It's great if you just file a great issue, have a feature request, and so forth, but these are people who actually wrote code. I think it's also important to realize that there's a full-time team working on Google. Many of them are here, and they're like a valid audience for this event. Like we're doing this also in big parts for ourselves. So many of these Google employees, they are here today and they work on AMP. It's about 22% of all contributors, which by the way I think is fascinating. So what's 22% of 710? I don't know, over 150 I think. Which I don't know. We were like 30, and I don't know who the other 120 people are. But it's a big company. But then people from around the world, and I think contributions are really accelerating. Over the last 30 days, there were 350 pull requests landing, which is quite a bit. So we sometimes talk about like how many AMP pages there are. Apparently, it's over 6 billion now. This is a dimensionless number that means nothing. Many of them are Pinterest pins. And people make a lot of Pinterest pins. So that doesn't matter, but it's still a very big number. And I think one of the unique things about AMP is that if you contribute, then within, depending on release cycle, 1 to 2 weeks, your change will run on every single one of these 6 billion pages. And that means you can have a lot of impact. It also means you can easily break a significant chunk of the internet. Obviously, we make sure that that doesn't happen too often. But I think it's in a way like not always the case that you contribute to open source and people actually use it. So here you pretty much have the guarantee. And I must say that I personally, I don't write that much code in AMP anymore, but sometimes I do. For example, like a few weeks ago, I saw my friend Rick tweet that there was now a thing called feature policy that made it possible to make so-called synchronous XHR illegal. And so I thought maybe I can like make a 10-line change to AMP to like prohibit this because it's really bad. And so I did, and I landed it. And now all the ads that are in AMP pages can't use this like really, really bad API anymore, which is a big win. And I think these the kind of changes that you can make without being like a full-on professional that are really impactful. As I said earlier, I wanted to talk about the governance topic. So what is governance for an open source project? If you hear open source, that open doesn't necessarily really mean openness, right? You can have very closed open source projects, and on the other side, the question is like, what happens if there's questions about the direction of a project? What if there are, questions being raised and answers have to be found, right? And the term that describes the answer to that question is the governance of the project. And when we released AMP about 3 years ago, there were 2 developers working on it. One was Dima, is he here? Maybe not. And the other one was me. And so we were thinking about what should be the governance of our project, and we decided that I would just make all the decisions, which seemed very reasonable at the time, right? And it's also not very uncommon to do it that way, because typically open source projects have a founder, they're the person who knows the most stuff, and then that's what you do. And obviously, as it goes bigger, delegation comes into play, and there's lots of people being responsible for all kinds of stuff. I'm not actually intimately familiar with AMP stories, which we'll hear after this talk, right? And so obviously someone else actually, has the real calls there. But there's this chain of responsibility that you find in most companies. And so that's a way to do it. But we've always kind of thought, and then it became more and more obvious that as the project grows and gains more constituencies, right? There's now thousands of developers using it. There's billions of users going to pages that use AMP, and they don't necessarily get representation if it's just me, this guy from the Bay Area making all the calls, right? And so that's why we want to create a governance model that has the chance of representing all the constituencies in a way that's not only in theory, but an official thing. I'm going to, however, not go into too much detail. Joey, who was just on stage before me, has a talk about this later today. So he talk about this stuff. All right. Next up, I'm going to talk about design. And by design, I mean software design. This might be very boring, but I find it exciting. I'm like a nerd for software design. So I'm going to talk about the principles of software design of AMP. They're actually on our webpage, but I want to give them some color. This is the most important one, which is something that not all web frameworks agree with. But we feel very, very strongly about this. So user experience is the most important thing, and it trumps developer experience. And developer experience is more important than ease of implementation. What does this mean? In many cases, none of these things are actually in any conflict, and that's great, right? But sometimes the solution of a problem in a way that's best for the user makes it slightly harder to program it for a developer that makes an AMP page. And in that case of conflict, we decide for the user. So it's slightly harder to develop AMP pages, but it's better for users, right? And so that's just a guideline for our decision making, that it will always be there. And then the last one is, I think, a little bit easier, which is that developer experience. So the people making AMP pages, they're more important than us as the people working on AMP, right? So ease of implementation of the feature in AMP. So that's our value chain. I think it's very, we should guide all our decisions when we think about changes that we're making to AMP. Another thing, and you can totally disagree with this, we don't design for an hypothetical faster future browser. Think back to 2015, we wanted to make something that actually made the internet fast using technologies that existed at the time. And going forward 3 years, this is still true, right? And things change and things evolve, and we can use more stuff. But we don't want to anticipate future developments and are potentially wrong and then have bad results for the billions of pages. One of the examples was that 3 years ago, we were designing the extension system that many of you have used, like AMP YouTube at Twitter, et cetera. And the back then obvious decision would have been to use something called HTML imports, which is a way to import custom elements or web components into web browsers. And it was shipped in Chrome, and it was not shipped in any other browsers. And there were signals that people were not so sure that it's the right thing, but there were also people who were feeling really strongly, if you want to do web components, you have to use HTML imports. And I was like, no, I don't think that's the right thing, because it means that in all these other browsers it's going to be slow, and I'm also not sure that this is actually going to happen. and then it didn't. So we got that right? Could have been the other way around, but I think in a way we make this conservative decisions, as much as that pains me. But it's a conservative framework. I found a picture of an actual walled garden. So one of the fundamental ideas of AMP is to not break the web. And what this means is that we make decisions in a way that aligns with the fundamental properties of the web. So one example early on was that one way to publish AMP documents could have been say upload them to Google using some REST API. Right? And still people ask me questions like, I have an AMP page, how do I upload it to Google? And I'm like, well, you put it on your web server. Right? It has to be part of the web. You cannot make an AMP page that's not part of the web. And there's many other things like it where this is a good guiding principle. This is actually my laptop. Fixed the escape button, and on the new USB-C chargers, it kept going out with a zip tie. So this is not the right way to solve problems. But it's very much something that happens in web development. So I think many of you have gone through something like this, where you were, we got some problems to solve, and the easiest way was to add some JavaScript to the page, and you did it because you need to ship tomorrow. And we face such challenges all the time, but we want to go back and see what's actually the right way to do it. So there are, for example, these A/B testing frameworks that allow you to change stuff on the page using JavaScript, and people like them because they can make changes to the pages without asking developers, right? And so here you make a decision that's really bad for users because it slows down the page, but it's really easy to implement, right? And that is in violation with our value chain, so we don't do that. Another example of this, where you at least have to think about it, is there are these affiliate link things that scan the page for links and add stuff to URL. Isn't it the right way to do it on the back end, where it has no client-side CPU cycles, right? So these things that we have to think about. We only want to do things that can be made fast, which I guess makes sense, but not always the case. However, and that kind of stands in conflict, or at least tension to the first principle. We want to prioritize things that improve user experience, but do compromise when needed, and find good solutions. Vamsi, who sits there, wrote a post. Have you published this yet?
No, I'll do it in the next
Cool. But the thing is actually there. So there's this thing. Who knows what header bidding is? Right? So it's a way to make your web page slower, and make more money, right? And so that's in violation with our value principles. However, I think we found a good compromise, which was to say we have this declarative system to talk to these people who want to give us money in a non-blocking way, and we give them 1 second to respond. And if they have a slow day, or if the internet is slow, then we'll ignore their response, right? And so you have it never slows you down more than 1 second, which I think is still a lot, but okay, better than potentially unbounded slowness that the normal approach brings, right? And I think these are the type of compromises that we need to think about. How can we achieve the business goal, which is to make more money, which is very important, but still have the users have an experience that's good for them. Next topic, by the way, this actually on our official site said no whitelist until recently, but because that's racist, we changed it. So no nice list or allowed list. And I actually want to bend this a little bit. So in security, it's very often important that you can enumerate everything that's legal. So for example, the AMP validator has a list of all the HTML tags. And so it's actually easy if your set is finite, they're fine, right? So if we really want to say you can't use these, but enumerate everything you can use, that's actually a good security practice. But you often have the case of infinite lists. So for example, there are infinite websites. But Google and Bing are very big websites. And so you might say embedding is only allowed into Google and Bing, right? And so that's a violation of this principle. Because that list is infinite, and we don't want to do that, right? We want to give everyone equal chance. Okay, whew. So that was this topic. I have actually more of them, just to bore you a little bit more. So what I talked about here was principles, or maybe even values is the better word, because you could take them and apply them to like React or Angular or like your website, and they would still apply, right? They're universal. You can disagree with them, but they're not. And there's nothing there really that's specific to AMP. So the next stuff is more concrete and more abstract, I guess, but specific to AMP. So because you don't, not everything wants to have instant loading, for example. But that's effectively a design goal of AMP, and it's a property of AMP pages that we don't want to violate over time. So whenever we make a change, we have to say, like, does it prohibit us from instant loading? If the answer is yes, then we can't do it. What I found, which is really interesting, is if you go through the list and you look at each one of them, if you have these like things that you think your software should do and you don't change them over time, then sometimes there are strategic opportunities that emerge from them that you couldn't have anticipated, and I'll go through them a little bit. So, but this one is clear. Like, AMP wants to enable documents to load instantly. It creates design tensions. So we want to do instant loading, but we want to do it in a privacy-sensitive way. What that means is, for example, on Google Search, when you, search for, my favorite example is diarrhea. I shouldn't really say this publicly, but you search for diarrhea, and there's two links. One is to WebMD, right? And one is to Wikipedia. And me being like new to the United States, I really just wanted to know what it is. I heard this word, right? And so I click Wikipedia, but WebMD was pre-rendered, and they had ads on there that did retargeting. And now I go to like the New York Times, and there's diarrhea ads, right? Not cool, because I never went to I never really went to this website that was able to track me. So AMP has this privacy invariant that's not happening, right? You can pre-render something without violating the user's privacy. And so that puts a lot of tension on the design. There's lots of things that you can't do if you want to keep that kind of privacy stuff in place. So we have to keep that in mind. This is another topic that's interesting. So portability. AMP originally was called PCU, Portable Content Unit, which, I don't know, maybe would have been a better name. So the idea was that you would have a website and you could display it somewhere else. So like, I don't know, virtual portability. You have a website and you display it in a search engine, or like in a news app, or like in Symphony Reader. While you can kind of do it with RSS, it was like very basic. And you can not really do it with websites. They don't really anticipate being in some context. They don't have a way to react to the context. And also websites usually are bound to their origin. So you can't rehost them from somewhere else and expect them to still work. So for AMP, the idea is that you can take a web page and I put it on a different origin, and it shouldn't break. And we try as hard as possible to make that work. Folks at Bing, who just launched their own M cache, certainly learned probably a few challenges regarding course, but it's definitely a principle. And I talked earlier about like how these strategic benefits emerge from this that we have never thought about. So because we designed for this, the thing that like AMP for email was very easy, because sending emails is like very different from web pages, and they can't make the same assumptions. And so like general web pages you can't send via email, but AMP pages you can actually send via email. It pretty much works. But when we originally designed this, we obviously did think about email. This is very related. Also could have switched the images and no one would have found it weird. So embeddability is just the idea that the page actually has a runtime API and can talk to the parent of the page. Especially in the web, that's really needed. In native apps, you can cheat. You can like inject your own JavaScript, but on the web, you can like iframe a page, and maybe you want like swiping or like have the header scroll away and have the page like tell the parent page that it's being scrolled. And normal web pages don't do this, right? And AMP pages do. So, but that's again just one example. We've talked about something called like a way to implement like actions with AMP at I/O, and they like take advantage of this a lot. Maybe we'll talk about this more today. But that's just another example. Obviously, we care about security. Embedding something into some app, basically the page inherits the security property of the parent and the other way around. So security is very important. And I talked about, for example, that pre-rendering stuff. If the privacy is fine, but then they can escape it using something like XSS hack, that would be bad, right? So it's very important. I think it's another thing also, again, like coming back to putting AMP into email. Emails have like very strong privacy guarantees. For example, they usually don't want the sender to know your IP address when you open it. At least like Gmail guarantees this. And so if you could do arbitrary things because you break through the security model, that would be bad. And then finally, obviously, privacy is. I talked about this a lot already. So if you're not from the US, this is so weird with the doors where you can look at people. So I already talked about privacy a lot, but I want to give one more point where basically the original design has then these emerging strategic properties that you couldn't have anticipated. So when we created AMP 3 years ago, we didn't know about GDPR, right? And but then it came around, and we needed to implement it, and there's AMP consent, which does that. But what I want to come back to is that privacy-preserving pre-rendering. Really what it meant was there was a system in AMP that controlled when requests were made to certain third-party entities that could do the tracking that wasn't allowed during pre-rendering phase, right? And so because we had this in place, implementing controls for GDPR on top of it was comparatively easy. Whereas for a regular website, obviously, who knows who I'm talking to, right? It's very hard to enumerate. And in AMP, having central controls for this was, again, comparatively trivial. I don't want to say it was that easy. Cool. So that was actually everything I want to talk about. I think this is, maybe not super exciting, but it's good to understand kind of the deeper thinking that went into the designs. And maybe next time you look at some intent to implement, you can go back to this presentation and think how does that change that we're proposing stand with relationship to these things. Cool. So kind of to close this out, I wanted to go through the things that I find exciting really right now, not just for 2019. And many of them kind of will be covered in a talk today or definitely in a breakout session tomorrow. In fact, when I created these slides, I added lots of breakout sessions so that I would have something I want to go to. By the way, I changed the slide, but Joey didn't reload the slides because I changed it to holy shit, we're going to run JavaScript in AMP. Yes, there's a session about this later today and a breakout session tomorrow. So that's obviously the most exciting thing we're doing right now from a change to AMP point of view. We also want to evolve the AMP component model, which means, for example, right now there's AMP carousel, and we have AMP bind and AMP JS. And you might want to do stuff like add slides at runtime, right? You can't do that, and it's really hard to implement this in the AMP component. And so we want to kind of change how they're written, which is not going to be a user-facing thing, but I think it's going to be make things easier. We have a prototype that does it with Preact, which I think is probably the right way to go. Similar topic. So lots of people come to me and say, you have these nice AMP components. Can we use them in non-AMP pages? And for the longest time, we said no. Or no, what I actually said, well, we can't stop you, but it might break, right? Because we make certain compatibility assumptions, you can't mess with our internals because you can't write JavaScript. Obviously, in non-AMP page, you can, and then things might break in arbitrary ways. So right now, it's possible, not supported. But since so many people are asking, we're considering to do it anyway. And so we definitely have a breakout session tomorrow to talk about how that can be implemented. One of the questions that I've been asking myself is there's AMP and there's PWA, and we talked about how you can use AMPs in PWAs, and you talked about how you can use build PWAs with AMPs, but couldn't it be that every AMP page is a PWA, right? I think it's a question that might have the answer yes. I also updated this slide because this is info missing. How do stories, and in particular AMP stories, work on the web? Right? So many of you might use Snapchat or Instagram to do stories, and that's cool. I do it. It's fun. But they're like as far away from the web as possible. With AMP stories, we created technology that makes it easy for everyone to make stories. It's an emerging ecosystem, so it's very, very young. And I think it's worth thinking about how they impact the web, and does it change like how navigation should work on the web? Because like I don't know, like in Instagram, between the normal feed and the stories, it's different. And so maybe they had an insight that we need to translate to the web. I don't know. Interesting way to think about it. And there's talk about this right after this. So that'll go into how stories works. All right. Yeah, I don't have a breakout session for this, but like sign in on the web is terrible. Amazon asked me to sign in every week, even though I like buy something there every day. And why are they doing it? Like it's terrible. So we should fix it. And I think we'll get there next year. There's also like this notion of assistive computing, which right now people, when they hear this, they either think I don't know what this means, or they think I talk to my Google Home or Alexa. And I don't think many people have a vision for how the web plays together with this new world of computing. And I think there is actually a connection, and I think we can make AMP play a role in that. So good thing to talk about. And then finally, how is that new governance thing going to work? Like obviously, we have a proposal. We want to hear your feedback. The timeline is to go into effect October 25th. So obviously, for me, there's a lot of uncertainty about how that's going to work out. Hopefully, it's going to be great. I think it's going to be great. But you never know. And yeah, that's actually all I had. Thank you very much.